The morning sun crept through the dusty windows of the Pinewood diner, catching on the worn countertops that had seen decades of coffee spills and pie crumbs. Lily Thompson wiped her hands on her faded apron and glanced at the old clock above, the kitchen door. 10 years had passed since she'd taken over the family business, and each year seemed harder than the last. At 32, the lines around her eyes told stories of early mornings and late nights, of drought seasons and watching neighbors pack up and leave. Pinewood Valley wasn't what it used to be. The once thriving ranching community had slowly dried up, literally and figuratively. 3 years without decent rain had turned the surrounding pastures to dust. Big city developers circled like vultures, offering cash to desperate families who couldn't remember the last time they'd turned a profit. The bell above the door jingled, pulling Lily from her thoughts. She looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the bright morning light. As the door swung shut behind him, she could make out his features: weathered skin, day-old stubble, and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm. His boots left little puffs of dust with each step, and the worn Stetson in his hands had clearly seen better days, just like everything else in this town. "Morning," he said, his voice deep but gentle as he settled onto a stool at the counter. "Just passing through. Heard this place makes a decent cup of coffee." Lily nodded, already reaching for the pot. "Strongest in 3 counties," she replied, setting a white mug in front of him. Steam rose between them as she poured. "Anything to eat?" The stranger glanced at the chalkboard menu, eyes lingering on the prices. "Whatever's cheapest," he said with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just another drifter, Lily thought. They got plenty of those. Cowboys looking for seasonal work, moving on when nothing panned out. Times were too hard for anyone to put down roots. "Hash browns and toast coming up," she called over her shoulder, heading to the kitchen where her Uncle Pete manned the grill. "Another drifter," she explained, clipping the order to the wheel. Pete glanced through the service window. "Mighty nice truck for a drifter," he observed, nodding toward the parking lot where a well-maintained but clearly not new pickup sat gleaming in the sun. Lily shrugged and returned to the counter, filling sugar dispensers and salt shakers while keeping an eye on her sole customer. He sat quietly, looking around the diner with curious eyes, taking in the faded photographs on the walls, pictures of Pinewood Valley in its heyday, when cattle drives brought cowboys through town and the harvest festivals drew people from miles around. "You from around here?" she asked, more out of habit than genuine curiosity. The man shook his head. "Not exactly. Grew up in a place a lot like this, though. Further north." When she brought his food, he thanked her with a nod and ate slowly, methodically, like a man who'd learned the hard way not to waste a thing. Lily busied herself with morning prep, trying not to notice how his gaze occasionally settled on her or how he seemed to be listening to the conversations of the few locals who trickled in for their morning coffee. Old Mr. Henderson took his usual, table by the window, newspaper spread wide. "Another ranch gone," he announced to no one in particular. "Wilson's finally sold to those Denver developers. Gonna be fancy vacation homes by next summer." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the diner. The stranger's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Shame," said Betty from the post office. 5 generations on that land. Remember when they used to host the spring dance in their big barn? Lily felt a familiar ache in her chest. The Wilsons had been good customers and better friends. Their youngest boy had sat behind her all through high. School had asked her to prom with wildflowers picked from their south pasture. "Way things are going," Pete called from the kitchen. "Won't be a working ranch left in the valley in 5 years." The stranger finished his meal in silence, left exact change on the counter, no tip, but Lily hadn't expected one, and headed for the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Good coffee," he said simply. "Might stop back tomorrow." Lily nodded, already turning to greet another customer. She didn't think much of it when his truck pulled away from the curb. Didn't notice how slowly he drove through town, eyes taking in every detail of the struggling main street. What Lily couldn't know was that beneath Jack Reynolds' dusty exterior and careful questions beat the heart of a man who'd left a town just like this 20 years ago, with nothing but determination and grit. She couldn't know that he'd built an empire in Denver real estate, that the plain silver watch on his wrist cost more than her diner made in a month, or that he now had bank accounts with more zeros than she could imagine. She couldn't know that. Something about her quiet determination had stirred memories he'd buried long ago, of his mother working double shifts after his father died, of community potlucks during hard times, of a way of life that was vanishing acre by acre across the American West. And she certainly couldn't know that as Jack drove away from Pinewood Valley that afternoon, his cell phone buzzing with messages from lawyers and business partners. He wasn't leaving at all. He was already thinking about coming back. The next morning, when the bell jingled again and she looked up to see the same tall figure silhouetted against the light, Lily simply reached for the coffee pot. Just another cowboy passing through, she thought. They never stayed long. She was wrong. Jack Reynolds hadn't just come back for the coffee. He'd come back because for the first time in 20 years he'd found something, someone worth staying for. Days turned into weeks, and Jack Reynolds became as much a fixture at the Pinewood Diner as the old jukebox in the corner. He'd arrive each morning just after opening, order the same simple breakfast and linger over coffee, his quiet presence becoming strangely comforting to Lily. At first she'd wondered what kept him in town. There wasn't exactly work for drifting cowboys these days, but she never asked. Folks had their reasons, and in Pinewood Valley, minding your own business was still considered good manners. The locals warmed to him gradually. Old Mr. Henderson shared stories of the valley's glory days when cattle drives would bring hundreds of men through town. Betty from the post office pointed out which families had been there for generations and which were newcomers, meaning they'd only arrived 40 years ago. Uncle Pete eventually invited Jack to the back to see his collection of vintage fishing lures, an honor he rarely bestowed on strangers. Jack asked questions, good ones, about water rights and grazing practices, about the drought and how folks were coping. He listened more than he talked, those storm-colored eyes taking everything in. Lily found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, noticing how he always swept up crumbs from his plate, how he'd step outside to take phone calls that seemed to leave him tense, how sometimes sadness would shadow his face when the old-timers talked about barns being torn down for fancy houses. "You never say why you're sticking around," Lily finally said one slow afternoon, refilling his coffee without being asked. Jack looked up, caught off guard. "Been asking myself the same thing," he admitted with that half-smile that had become familiar. "Guess I like the quiet. Gives a man time to think." "Must be nice," she replied, wiping the counter with more force than necessary. "Some of us are too busy keeping the lights on to do much thinking." Something flickered in his eyes. Respect, maybe. "Your family's owned this place a long time?" "My grandmother started it in '68. Mom took over in '92. Now it's me." Lily looked around at the worn booths, the photos on the wall, the coffee machine that wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. "Not much, but it's ours. For now, anyway." Before Jack could respond, the bell jangled as Tom Preston pushed through the door, face flushed with anger. He threw himself onto a stool, nodding curtly to Jack. "Coffee, Lily. Strong as you can make it." "What's got you all worked up?" she asked, already pouring. "Just came from the town meeting. That snake Henry Blackwood is selling Cedar Ridge Ranch." The diner went quiet. Cedar Ridge was the largest property in the valley, 5,000 acres of prime land that had been in the Blackwood family for over a century. Henry had inherited it from his father 5 years ago and immediately moved to a condo in Denver, leaving the once thriving operation to caretakers who did the minimum to keep it running. "Selling to who?" Uncle Pete asked, emerging from the kitchen. "Some outfit from California. Gonna chop it into 20-acre ranchettes with a golf course and a spa." Tom spat the words. Called it rustic luxury living, like that means something. Lily felt her stomach sink. Cedar Ridge Ranch bordered nearly every other property in the valley. Once it was developed, the rest would fall like dominoes. "How many jobs will that bring?" someone asked hopefully. "Construction crews will come. From the city," Tom said. "Maybe they'll need a few maids and gardeners when it's done. That's about it." As conversation erupted around them, Lily glanced at Jack, surprised to find him watching her with an intensity that made her look away. The news hung over the town like a storm cloud. Henry Blackwood was scheduled to sign the final papers in 3 weeks. Some folks talked about pooling resources to make a counteroffer, but the numbers were impossible. Others resigned themselves to the changing times. A few, like Lily, just tried not to think about it. Jack continued his daily visits, but something had shifted. He took more phone calls, disappeared for a day or two, then returned, looking preoccupied. Lily told herself it wasn't any of her business. He'd move on eventually. They always did. One evening, as she was locking up after a particularly slow day, she turned to find Jack leaning against his truck in the parking lot. "You scared me half to death," she said, hand pressed to her chest. "Sorry." He pushed off the truck and stepped into the pool of light from the street lamp. "I've been thinking about what Tom said about Cedar Ridge." Lily sighed, keys dangling from her fingers. "Everybody's talking, nobody's doing. That's how it goes." "What if someone could do something?" Jack asked quietly. "Stop the development. Keep the land whole." "Like who?" Lily scoffed. "The bank won't loan to ranchers anymore, not with the drought." "Someone with resources, someone who cares about places like this." Something in his tone made her look at him. Really look at him. His clothes were worn but well made. His truck was older but meticulously maintained. His hands were calloused, but his watch was expensive. "Why do you care what happens to our valley?" she asked slowly. "You're just passing through." Jack was quiet for a long moment. "I grew up in a place a lot like this," he finally said. "Watched it get swallowed up by people who saw the land as nothing but dollar signs. There wasn't anybody. Who could stop it then? And now?" Lily pressed. Jack took a deep breath. "Now I'm wondering what this place means to you. If someone kept Cedar Ridge as it is, no golf courses, no ranchettes, what would that be worth?" Lily leaned against her car, suddenly tired. "It would mean everything," she whispered. "This valley's not just land, it's people, history, a way of living. Once that's gone, you can't get it back." In the dim light, she couldn't read his expression, but she felt something pass between them. An understanding, maybe, or a promise. What Lily didn't know, couldn't know, was that Henry Blackwood had already received an anonymous offer for Cedar Ridge Ranch. An offer well above the developer's price. With one unusual condition: the buyer's identity would remain secret until the papers were signed. And as Jack Reynolds watched Lily drive away, the weight of what he was about to do settled firmly on his shoulders. The sky opened up on a Tuesday, morning in April. Rain came down in sheets, drumming against the diner's tin roof so loudly that customers had to raise their voices to be heard. Nobody complained. After 18 months of drought, the downpour felt like a miracle. "Look at that," Uncle Pete said, his nose pressed against the window. Coming down hard enough to float an ark. Farmers and ranchers huddled over coffee, eyes bright with cautious hope. Old-timers debated whether it would be enough to replenish the creek beds. The mood in the diner was lighter than it had been in months. Only Lily found herself distracted, glancing at the door every time the bell jingled. It had been 3 days since she'd seen Jack. 3 days since their strange conversation in the parking lot. She told herself she was being silly. He owed her nothing, not even a goodbye. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been left unfinished between them. The rain continued for 2 full days, soaking deep into the thirsty ground. Green shoots appeared in pastures that had been brown for too long. The creek that ran through town swelled its banks, gurgling happily after months of silence, but Jack Reynolds didn't return. "Probably moved on," Uncle Pete said when he caught Lily checking the parking lot again. "That type always does." Lily nodded, busying herself with refilling salt shakers. Good riddance, one less coffee cup to wash. But the diner felt emptier. Somehow, quieter. She found herself missing his questions, his careful observations, the way he really listened when the old-timers told their stories, missing the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. As the days stretched into a week and then 2, Lily did her best to forget about Jack Reynolds. The valley had more pressing concerns. Henry Blackwood was due in town any day to finalize the sale of Cedar Ridge Ranch. Already, surveyors had been spotted marking boundaries for the future development. Rumors flew about who had bought the property. Betty from the post office swore it was a famous Hollywood actor looking to build a private compound. Tom Preston heard it was a foreign billionaire who collected ranches like other people collected stamps. Mr. Henderson was convinced it was one of those tech companies planning to build robot cowboys. Whoever it is, Lily said as she wiped down tables after the lunch rush. Let's hope they change their mind about chopping it up. That land should stay whole. Uncle Pete grunted from behind the grill. Money talks, sweetheart, always has. That evening, as Lily was counting out the register, headlights swept across the diner windows. She looked up to see a familiar truck, pulling into the lot. Her heart did a strange little skip. She watched through the blinds as Jack stepped out, looking different somehow. His jeans and boots were the same, but he'd traded his worn flannel for a crisp button-down. His hair was neatly trimmed. Lily hesitated, then walked to the door and unlocked it. "We're closed," she said, not moving aside to let him in. "I know." Jack stood on the threshold, hands in his pockets. "I was hoping to talk to you. 2 weeks without a word and now you want to talk?" Lily crossed her arms. "I'm not sure I'm interested in what you have to say." Jack's eyes, those storm cloud eyes, held hers steadily. 5 minutes, please." Something in his expression made her step back, allowing him inside. She flipped on one row of lights and perched on a stool, watching as he paced the length of the counter. "I've been in Denver," he said finally, "taking care of some business." "The mysterious business that brings you to a dying ranching town in the middle of nowhere?" Lily asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Jack stopped pacing and faced her. "I'd like to show you something tomorrow if you're free." "Show me what?" "It's easier if I just take you there," he said. "Do you trust me?" The question hung between them. Did she trust this man who had appeared out of nowhere, who clearly wasn't telling her everything? Lily thought about how he'd helped Mr. Henderson change a flat tire, how he'd fixed the diner's leaky faucet without being asked, how he treated everyone with the same quiet respect. "I get off at 3, she said finally. Jack's smile made something warm unfurl in her chest. "I'll be here at 3:15. True to his word, Jack pulled up just as Lily was hanging her apron. The afternoon was glorious, the world washed clean by the recent rains. As they drove out of town, Lily rolled down her window, breathing in the sweet scent of wet earth and new growth. "Where are we going?" she asked when Jack turned onto the road that led up to Lookout Ridge, the highest point in the valley. "You'll see," was all he said. The road wound higher, switchbacks offering glimpses of the valley spread out below them. The late afternoon sun gilded the landscape, making the rainwater pooled in fields shimmer like scattered coins. From up here you could see for miles. The town nestled by the creek, the patchwork of ranches and farms, and dominating it all, the vast expanse of Cedar Ridge with its distinctive red barn. Jack pulled over at the summit and cut the engine. For a long moment they just sat in silence, taking in the view. "I used to come up here as a kid," Lily said softly. "My dad would bring a picnic. He said you could see all the way to tomorrow from here." Jack nodded. "It's beautiful." "It is," she agreed. "Even now, with everything so uncertain." Jack shifted, in his seat, turning toward her. "That's actually why I brought you here. I wanted to talk about Cedar Ridge." Lily sighed. "What's left to say? By next year it'll be all fancy houses and people who don't even live here most of the time." "Maybe not." Jack reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "What if I told you someone bought Cedar Ridge with no plans to develop it?" Lily stared at him. "What do you mean?" "Who?" Jack took a deep breath. "Me." The world seemed to tilt beneath Lily. "You? But how? Why?" "It's a long story," he said, opening the envelope to reveal a stack of documents. "One that starts 20 years ago in a town a lot like this one, with a boy who left with nothing but promised himself he'd come back someday with enough to make a difference." As the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains, Jack Reynolds finally told Lily Thompson who he really was. The news spread through Pinewood Valley like wildfire. Henry Blackwood was coming to town on Saturday to sign the final papers for Cedar Ridge Ranch and introduce the mysterious buyer. The old Grange Hall, rarely used these days except for the occasional wedding reception, would host what everyone was calling a transition ceremony, though most locals saw it more as a funeral for their way of life. Lily hadn't told a soul what Jack had revealed on Lookout Ridge. His story had seemed impossible at first. The poor ranch hand's son who'd left with $50 in his pocket and built a real estate empire in Denver, who'd made his fortune developing land, but had never forgotten where he came from, who'd returned to Pinewood Valley by chance and stayed because something about the struggling town and its determined people had awakened old dreams he thought long buried. "Why tell me?" she'd asked as they drove back down the mountain. The documents that proved his ownership of Cedar Ridge tucked away again. Why keep it secret from everyone else? Jack's hands had tightened on the steering wheel. I needed to understand this place first. Really understand it. Not as some rich outsider swooping in to save everyone, but as someone who cared enough to listen. His eyes had caught hers briefly. And I'm telling you because I trust you. Because I think you might understand why this matters so much to me. Now, as Saturday approached, Lily found herself guarding Jack's secret while fielding endless questions about the mysterious buyer. The stress of it had her snapping at Uncle Pete and forgetting orders. When Betty from the post office asked, for the third time, if she'd heard anything about the new owner, Lily nearly dropped a pot of coffee. "For heaven's sake," she'd exclaimed, "we'll all find out tomorrow." Saturday dawned clear and cool. Lily spent extra time on her appearance, settling on a simple blue dress she usually saved for special occasions. She told herself it was because the whole town would be at the Grange Hall, not because Jack had asked if she'd be there, his eyes hopeful. The hall was packed by the time she arrived. Farmers in their good shirts, ranchers in cleaned-up boots, shopkeepers and teachers and the retired folks who'd lived in the valley their whole lives, all gathered to witness the changing of hands that would shape their future. Henry Blackwood stood at the front, looking uncomfortable in an expensive suit that couldn't hide how city life had softened him. His family had worked this land for generations, but he'd never had dirt under his fingernails or calluses on his palms. Beside him stood a lawyer, with a sleek briefcase and a stack of documents. Lily slipped into a seat near the back, scanning the crowd for Jack. She didn't see him anywhere. "Folks, thanks for coming," Henry began awkwardly. "As you know, I've decided to sell Cedar Ridge Ranch. It wasn't an easy decision, but times change, and we all have to adapt." A murmur of disagreement rippled through the crowd. Henry cleared his throat. "I know there's been a lot of talk about development plans. I want to assure you that the buyer has been very clear about his intentions for the property. But rather than me trying to explain, I think it's best if he tells you himself." Henry glanced toward the side door. "I'd like to introduce the new owner of Cedar Ridge Ranch." The door opened, and Jack walked in. A collective gasp rose from the gathering. Confusion rippled across faces as people recognized the quiet stranger, who'd been drinking coffee at Lily's diner for weeks. Jack looked different today, his usual worn clothes replaced by a simple but clearly expensive dark suit. He still wore his boots, though, and his hair was slightly tousled as if he'd run, his hands through it nervously. "Many of you know me as Jack Reynolds," he said, his deep voice carrying in the sudden silence. "I've been living among you, getting to know this valley and its people. What most of you don't know is that I came here because places like Pinewood Valley are disappearing across the West, and I wanted to understand why, and whether anything could be done about it." He moved to stand beside Henry, who looked as shocked as everyone else at the revelation of the buyer's identity. "I didn't buy Cedar Ridge to develop it," Jack continued. "I bought it to preserve it." The silence broke as voices rose in confusion and disbelief. Jack raised a hand, waiting for quiet. "My plan is simple. Cedar Ridge will remain a working ranch, employing local cowboys and using traditional practices that respect the land. I'm establishing a conservation easement that will permanently protect it from development." His eyes swept the crowd. This valley has something special, something worth saving. Not just the land, but the community, the knowledge passed down through generations, the way of life that shaped this part of the country. Uncle Pete stood up from his seat. You some kind of environmental nut? A ripple of laughter broke the tension. Jack smiled. No, sir. I'm a businessman who believes there's value in more than just profit. I believe we can find ways to make ranching viable again, even with the challenges of drought and changing markets. Questions flew from all directions. Would local ranchers get grazing rights? Would he hire valley residents? Was this some kind of tax scheme? Jack answered each one patiently, explaining his vision for a demonstration ranch that would blend traditional practices with new techniques for sustainability. Throughout it all, his eyes kept finding lilies in the crowd. Each time, something unspoken passed between them. A shared understanding, a private connection in the midst of public revelation. As the formal part of the ceremony concluded, and people gathered in clusters to discuss this unexpected turn of events, Jack made his way through the crowd toward Lily. He stopped just short of reaching her, suddenly hesitant. So, she said, a small smile playing at her lips. Not just passing through after all. Around them, the mood of the gathering had transformed. Where there had been resignation, now there was cautious hope. Where there had been division, now there was animated discussion. The future of Cedar Ridge, and by extension, the valley, itself had suddenly shifted from an ending to a new beginning. Jack glanced at the people around them, then back to Lily. I have one more surprise, he said quietly. But this one's just for you. Can you meet me at the diner later? Lily studied him. This man who had appeared in her life disguised as a drifter and had revealed himself to be so much more. I'll be there, she promised. Neither of them could have predicted the journey that had brought them to this moment, or the path that stretched before them now. 1 year could change everything. Lily thought about this as she flipped the closed sign to open on a bright spring morning. Sunshine poured through the freshly washed windows of the diner, catching on the new curtains and the polished counter. The old place looked better than it had in years. Not fancy, but cared for. Loved. Outside, Pinewood Valley was coming back to life. The drought had broken for good last summer, bringing the kind of deep, soaking rains that old-timers said they remembered from childhood. The creek ran full and strong. Fields that had been brown and dusty now grew tall with grass and wildflowers. But it wasn't just the weather that had changed. Cedar Ridge Ranch hummed with activity these days. Jack had been true to his word, hiring local hands and bringing in experts to teach sustainable ranching practices. The old barn had been restored, its red paint gleaming in the sun. Cattle grazed on land that had stood empty for too long. Most surprising of all had been the Cedar Ridge Foundation, established with Jack's money but run by a board of valley residents. The foundation had purchased 3 more struggling ranches over the past year, not to consolidate them but to keep them intact and working. Young families who might have given up and moved to the city now had support, training, and hope for the future. The bell above the door jingled as the first customers of the day arrived, a pair of college students interning at the foundation for the summer. Lily greeted them with coffee and fresh muffins still warm from the oven. Ms. Thompson, one called as she turned to help another early bird. When's the next community dinner at the ranch? My parents are visiting, and I want them to see what we're doing here. Saturday week, Lily answered with a smile. Tell them to bring their dancing shoes. Pete's son is bringing his band. The monthly gatherings at Cedar Ridge had become the heart of community life. Everyone pitched in, ranchers and townspeople alike, young and old. They shared meals and music, traded stories and skills. Children played in the same fields where their grandparents had run wild decades before. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was real. It was theirs. The morning rush kept Lily busy until nearly 10, when the door opened and Jack walked in. Her heart did that funny little skip it always did when she saw him, even now. Morning, boss, she called with a grin. He laughed, sliding onto his usual stool at the counter. That joke's getting old. You've owned this place outright for 3 months now. It was true. With business picking up and a small loan from the foundation, Lily had finally paid off the last of her grandmother's mortgage. The diner belonged to the Thompson family free and clear for the first time in 50 years. Still feels strange, she admitted, pouring his coffee just the way he liked it. Having breathing room. Jack's eyes, still that same storm cloud blue, softened as they looked at her. You earned it. This place is the heart of the town. Flatterer. She pushed a plate with his usual breakfast toward him. You're early today. Foundation meeting canceled? Something like that. He took a sip of coffee, watching her over the rim of his mug. Actually, I wanted to ask if you could get away this afternoon. There's something I want to show you. Lily raised an eyebrow. Another surprise? Last time you said that you unveiled plans for the community center. This is different, Jack said, a hint of nervousness in his voice that intrigued her. This is just for us. 4 hours later, they were driving the familiar road up to Lookout Ridge, just as they had a year ago when Jack had first revealed his true identity to her. The day was gloriously clear, offering views all the way to the distant mountains. Below them, the valley spread out like a patchwork quilt, fields and pastures in a dozen shades of green, dotted with barns and houses and the glint of water. Jack parked in the same spot as before and came around to open her door. They stood, side by side, taking in the view in comfortable silence. Remember the first time I brought you up here? He asked finally. Lily nodded. You showed me the paperwork for Cedar Ridge. I thought you were crazy. Maybe I was. His smile was warm. Best kind of crazy, though. They walked to the guardrail at the edge of the lookout. Jack seemed unusually quiet, his hands in his pockets, shoulders tense. Everything okay? Lily asked. You seem jumpy. Jack took a deep breath. I've been thinking about that day a lot lately, about why I came back to a place like this after spending so many years trying to get away from one. And? She prompted when he fell silent again. And I realized something. He turned to face her fully. I didn't just buy this valley for the community, Lily. I bought it because the first day I walked into your diner, I saw someone fighting for something meaningful, and I wanted to be part of that story. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, hand-carved with delicate wildflowers. This past year has been the happiest of my life, he continued, voice steady even as his hands trembled slightly. Building something here, working with the community, seeing this place come back to life. But mostly, being with you. Lily's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a simple ring with a stone the exact blue-green of the creek that ran through their valley. I don't want to just pass through your life, Lily Thompson, Jack said softly. I want to stay. For good. Tears blurred her vision, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. This man who had appeared out of nowhere, who could have bought anything in the world but had chosen to save their forgotten corner of it, who looked at her like she was something precious. Is that a yes? He asked, uncertainty flickering across his face. Lily laughed, the sound carrying out across the valley. They both loved. That's a yes, Cowboy, that's a definite yes. As Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, Lily thought about how stories never really end. They just change, grow, become something new. The story of their valley had been one of struggle and loss, and now it was one of renewal and hope. Her own story had been about holding on, surviving. Now it would be about building something new with the man beside her. The cowboy who had passed through had not only stayed, but had helped secure a future for the place she loved. And in doing so had found his own home at last.